the Canon Powershot V1 and the Canon R50V. What makes these cameras so special and how do they compare to each other? Let's find out. So the basic selling points of these two cameras is they are video-centric cameras with a lightweight design, they have a cinematic gamma curve of C-Log-free, quality autofocus, and they are relatively inexpensive, being roughly under $2,000, so great access point. If you're looking for a Canon camera that's quick and subtle but still has accurate colors, or maybe you're looking for a more affordable entry point into the Canon range and lenses, then these two cameras are definitely for you. I will admit that Canon are a little bit late to the party as far as current compact and vlogging cameras are concerned, but I do think it's worth the wait as they have made sure to have all their bases covered here with these two cameras. These cameras do not come up short in any category, with one exception to the V1, but I will get into that later in the video. Today's video is a quick comparison of these two cameras and what makes them so different from one another, given they're both releasing on the same day, as well as a general quick first look at them. We will of course be doing a full review on each of the cameras, really testing out the specs and getting that information you can't just get off the spec sheet later on in the coming weeks. So be sure to follow us on YouTube and stay up to date. So the Powershot V1 has a 22 megapixel CMOS sensor, and what makes this sensor so special from other compact cameras, this sensor is 1.4 inches in comparison to other cameras, compact cameras, which are 1 inch. So you're getting half an inch or roughly half an inch difference on this sensor. And you know, don't believe the lies, half an inch does make all the difference. But that's actually not the only thing that this camera beats other compact cameras out on. This also has one of the widest fixed lenses on the market, being 16 to 50mm with an f-stop of 2.4 to 4.5. That is honestly an amazing range to have for a compact camera, as it means I can go incredibly wide with landscape shots, but if I want to sort of, do close-ups or mid shots, I can still move to 50mm. As for IBIS, this camera does not have IBIS inside it. It does have digital image stabilization instead, so you can go from off, standard to enhanced, with enhanced, of course, cropping in on the video. Another special thing about this camera is it also does have an internal ND filter, which is going to be great for all your content creators that like shooting outdoors. And it means you also save a bit of money, as now you don't have to go buy an ND filter for this camera, as it's already inside the camera. The R50V is a different beast though. The sensor on this camera is a 24.2 megapixel sensor, so that's roughly 2 megapixels bigger than the Powershot V1, and it is an APS-C sensor, but it's not a 1.4 inch APS-C sensor. Also, this camera isn't a fixed lens camera. It's actually, and this is a big deal to me, an RF mount. So that means that I have access to all these high quality RF lenses on a vlogging camera. As well as being adaptable with RFS lenses, this camera is also adaptable with VR lenses, which are much more current lenses and are currently only compatible with the R7, which is a more expensive Canon camera and also a more photo focused camera. So really with the R50V, you're getting access to VR lenses at a more inexpensive camera that's more focused on video. So as someone that shoots a whole lot of Canon, it is really good to have a vlogging option where I don't necessarily have to go out and buy a whole lot of new lenses just to make it work. I can still keep using my RF lenses, which I love. Speaking of new lenses though, this camera does actually come with its own kit lens, an RFS 16 to 30mm with an f-stop of 4 to 6.3. So this lens is actually one of the lightest lenses currently on the RFS market, weighing just under 181 grams, very lightweight. It also does have an internal zoom in it, which means the weight doesn't change when you move into different focal lengths, which is going to matter if you have this camera on a gimbal and don't want to have to rebalance the camera every time you have to change focal lengths on the camera. Another special thing about this lens is it also does have power zoom functionality. So when you combine this lens with this camera, the R50V, you can have a little trigger on top of the camera that basically controls the zoom of the camera. So you don't have to zoom with your hands or on the lens, you can just pull this trigger and it will adjust the zoom like so. Now what these cameras do have in common, and I think it's one of the biggest things about these cameras, is they both have C-Log-free. Now C-Log-free is a cinematic gamma curve that you will typically find in the more cinema EOS range of Canon cameras, the higher end, more expensive cameras. So it's very impressive they put this C-Log-free inside such inexpensive cameras. It's basically giving you access to a format that, while looks fairly washed out initially, when you throw a LUT on it, you have access to more dynamic range and more colors, which gives you a much better looking video in comparison to other vlogging and compact cameras. But that was definitely the thing that impressed me most about these cameras. Like C-Log-free, you can typically only access these in cameras like the R5, the R5 Mark II, and the R1. So having them accessible in a more inexpensive camera, that's great. Now, autofocus. So both these cameras do have very sticky and persistent autofocus, but where they differ is on the type of autofocus. Now, the Powershot V1 has a subject detection autofocus that can pick up different types of subjects like people and animals, and it's very similar to the R6 Mark II as far as autofocus is concerned. But the R50V is different in that it's an AI-based autofocus. So what this autofocus is special about is it does actually have a subject registration mode. So basically I can go into this camera and select very particular people I want this camera to grab autofocus on. And as soon as that person enters the frame, the camera will know to lock autofocus on that person. So this is going to matter if you say at a concert and you want to register the face of a pop star, or maybe the wedding and you want to make sure the autofocus locks on the bride and groom and not someone sitting in the crowd. I do also find that subject registration is something I do like to use a lot, as if I'm sort of shooting content outdoors. I've had this issue happen to me before where people will be walking in the background and the autofocus will be constantly pulling to those people in the background. So this subject registration is important. I have it registered my face, the autofocus stays on my face and ignores the people in the background, keeping everything looking nice. This camera also does have demo autofocus, which I love that they've put this into a Canon camera. Basically, if you're to hold a product or an object up in front of camera, the autofocus will automatically pull from your face to that object. So it doesn't matter if you're holding the object off a little bit to the left or the right, the autofocus will know to focus on the object in the foreground. So this is going to matter if you're, say, shooting, collectible cards or makeup, and you don't necessarily want to have to trick the autofocus by covering your face or your eyes. This autofocus is smart enough to pull to that object in the foreground. Although do keep in mind the demo autofocus is locked to the auto mode of this camera. So when it comes to the autofocus, the Powershot V1 does have very fast responsive autofocus, but I do find myself gravitating towards the R50V purely for that subject registration and that demo autofocus. So in terms of build, these cameras are both fairly lightweight cameras with minimal button layout. But what's special about the V1 is it does actually have its own internal fan, which is impressive given that the camera isn't even that big, but still manages to fit a fan inside it. With this fan, and basically the camera is able to operate at like 30 degrees for 2 hours without overheating. And really the battery runs out before this camera even gets a chance to overheat. So that's pretty impressive. It's definitely going to matter if you want to have a camera stay cool constantly, as I typically shoot with an R5 Mark II, and even that camera does start to overheat at 2 hours. But with the Powershot V1, provided I have a consistent power source, which of course I can power via the USB-C, the same as the R50V, this camera can actually stay cool in relatively humid conditions. And the fan is also fairly quiet. Another little cool thing of design about the Powershot V1 is they have a little wedge in the grip here. So basically this camera is much more comfortable to hold if you're doing selfie content. My thumb fits perfectly fine in this camera, and yeah, I do like the grip design. Although if you have bigger hands, you're probably going to have trouble with this camera in general, as well as the R50V. But that's the nature of compact and vlog cameras. Now this is probably going to be a bit of a point against the Powershot V1. Unfortunately, this camera does not have an internal flash like a lot of other compact cameras. So now personally for me, this doesn't matter. I like to use a lot of external LEDs and available lighting. But for a lot of compact camera users, this is going to be a bit of a deal breaker. Of course, you do just have to weigh up your options. Do you want the internal flash of other cameras, or do you want the larger sensor as well as the wider lens of the Powershot V1? The R50V though is great if you're someone that's into shooting a whole lot of vertical content. For starters, this camera does have a thread on the side of the camera, so you can actually mount this camera vertically. And when you rotate this camera to a vertical position, the UI on the screen will actually rotate to a vertical layout. You can of course turn this feature off in the settings, but it's great. Another thing I also do like is they do have a second recording button on the front of the camera, conveniently positioned in a place where if you were to hold this camera in a vertical position for selfie content, your thumb would be right over this button. So that makes it that much easier when shooting vertical selfie content with this camera. So yeah, there are some very distinct differences between these cameras. The Powershot V1 of course has that impressive internal cooling fan, but the R50V does have a better button layout in my personal opinion. A little nitpick about these cameras though is they do both use SD cards, which I'm personally not a fan of using. I just find them to be a bit too flimsy and weak in comparison to a lot of CF Express cards nowadays, but SD cards are easier to find. And one thing I actually really do like about these SD card compatibility of these cameras is with a lot of other cameras, when I'm recording 120 frames per second, I need an SD card with a video speed of 90. But what I was surprised to find in this camera, and I really don't hope they change in a firmware update, is that you could actually record 120 frames per second with a video speed of 30. So I could actually use slightly weaker SD cards inside this camera and record slow-mo footage. So if you're in general just trying to save a bit of money as far as memory cards go, these cameras are good purely for those SD card options. So that's the Powershot V1 and the R50V, and what do I think of these cameras as a Canon user? Well, I am very impressed that they've managed to put C-Log free inside such inexpensive cameras, and I do love that there's now a vlog camera option that I can mount my RF lenses to. These cameras definitely do feel like bare bones alternatives to my R5C and my R5 II, and they would be very useful in situations where I might not have the time to quickly set up a camera, as the R5 Mark II, as much as I love it, it does take a moment to set up. Whereas with the R50V or the Powershot V1, I can simply hold it up and activate it as quickly as I would a phone. I do think it's still a shame that with the Powershot V1, it doesn't have an internal flash, but I do also think that's the trade-off you get for having an internal fan, as well as the widest lens on the compact camera market. Really, you gotta weigh up your options sort of there. I would still reach for the Powershot V1 if I had to pick a compact camera, purely because I'm, well, someone that works with a lot of external lighting anyway. I'm not a fan of flash. I feel it's a bit too aggressive, a bit too flat, but you know, people are gonna disagree, bring it on. But what do you think of these cameras? Which one do you prefer? Let me know in the comments below.